The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. If you're new to our podcast, I'm Wes, and that's my wife and co-host, Beth.
Hello.
And each week we delve into stories that piqued our curiosity. So without any further ado and no housekeeping this week, let's get into it. Where did your mind wander for this episode, Beth?
Traveling by sea has always been treacherous, from the moment the first people put a boat in the water and pushed away from shore. Maritime disasters have always captured our attention, not just because of the incredible fear people must have felt as a ship broke apart beneath them, but also because of the many horrors potentially waiting in the water itself. From freezing cold temperatures to sharks to drowning from exhaustion, the struggle for survival after a shipwreck began as soon as people entered the water. So what about those ships that didn't wreck but appear perfectly intact, traveling on the waves with absolutely no crew? What is it about ghost ships that capture our imagination? Is it the ship itself, floating unmanned out on the high seas, or the mystery of what happened to its crew? The Mary Celeste was a ghost ship. And when she was discovered in the Azores in 1872, sailing 400 miles from where she was supposed to be, a new enduring mystery began. What happened to her crew? How did they just simply disappear? In November of 1872, 37-year-old Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs set sail from New York Harbor, along with 7 crew members and his own wife and 2-year-old daughter. Briggs spent his whole life at sea and was highly respected by his crew for being a fair captain. By 1872, he had already captained a brigantine named the Seafoam and a 3-masted schooner named the Forest King. His brother was also a master mariner, and they frequently sailed together. Although he was a staunch believer in abstinence, Briggs married Sarah Cobb, the daughter of a reverend. They had 2 children, Arthur and Sophia. Just a year before becoming captain of the Mary Celeste, both Briggs and his brother thought about giving up sailing and opening a hardware store in New Bedford, Massachusetts. But Briggs continued sailing and had the Mary Celeste outfitted with a cabin, so his wife and daughter could go on the voyage from New York to Genoa, Italy, with him. Arthur, their son, remained home so he could attend school. Just a few evenings before setting sail, Briggs dined with fellow captain and good friend David Morehouse. Briggs was in good spirits. The run was simple enough, from New York to Genoa. It must have been a comfort to him, too, to be able to bring his wife Sarah and daughter Sophia. Oh, they also brought a cat on board. The Mary Celeste sailed directly into raging storms and constant bad weather for 2 straight weeks. On November 24th, Captain Briggs wrote in the ship's log that after battling winds reaching 35 knots and rough seas, they had finally arrived in the Azores off the coast of Portugal, and he could see Santa Maria Island. They were safe at last. Captain Briggs' log ended the very next morning, November 25th, 1872, at 5 a.m., with no further details. A week later, on December 5th, Captain Morehouse, that friend that Captain Briggs had dined with, was on his way through the Mediterranean on the ship De Gratia. He sighted something very strange. Off in the distance was another ship that seemed to be sailing erratically, as if no one was in command. Its mainsail was furled, and the topmast sail was torn. As he looked closer, he was even more perplexed. It appeared to be the Mary Celeste, 400 miles off course. Despite strong winds and choppy water, Morehouse sailed closer to the Mary Celeste and was alarmed when none of her crew seemed ready to greet him. Concerned, he ordered his first mate, Oliver DeVoe, to board her. He noted that the Mary Celeste was drifting at about 38 degrees north, 17 degrees west. He assumed that the crew had all become sick and were too weak to man their posts. But once he boarded the ship, he quickly realized that sickness wasn't the issue. Of the 1,700 barrels of alcohol, all but 9 were still accounted for. There was some water in the hull, but the Mary Celeste was still perfectly seaworthy. There was enough food and water to sustain the small crew for another 6 months. But the Mary Celeste was a true ghost ship. Not a single person was on board. Now, the one lifeboat was missing, which gave DeVoe and Morehouse some hope, so they checked Briggs' captain's log. But there was nothing. Not a single clue written by Briggs to even hint at what had happened or where he, his family, the cat, or his crew had gone. And since there was no evidence of piracy, since almost all of the alcohol they were carrying was still there, and all of the crew's personal belongings were still carefully packed away and accounted for, it was truly a mystery. The Mary Celeste wasn't always the Mary Celeste, and she changed hands quite a bit before Captain Briggs took over. She was built between 1860 and 1861 in Nova Scotia and was first named the Amazon. She was a brigantine with 2 masts. On her maiden voyage, the captain, Robert McClellan, became ill and had to turn back to port without completing the voyage. He passed away just a few days later. By 1867, the Amazon was shipwrecked at least once. She was rebuilt and changed ownership twice before being sold in New York as a, quote, wrecked vessel in 1868. The new owner sunk a lot of money into repairing her and renamed her the Mary Celeste.
I always thought that it was bad luck to rename a ship.
It is, I guess, unless you perform a purging and renaming ceremony before you bring anything onto the ship with its new name written on it. So I have no idea if the new owner did that, but I do know that he only held on to her for 10 months before he sold her. Captain James Winchester purchased Mary Celeste in 1869, making several changes to her. He also sold a third of the shares to Captain Briggs. This comes into play later when theories ran wild about what exactly had happened to the crew. So, back to 1872. Once Captain Morehouse determined that the Mary Celeste was a ghost ship, he towed her 800 miles to Gibraltar. A British Vice Admiralty convened a salvage hearing. According to law, if a ship towed an abandoned ship back to port, the abandoned ship's insurers would pay the salvagers for their troubles. Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General in charge of the case, thought the whole thing stunk. He thought it was suspicious.
It certainly does sound suspicious.
He assumed that because Briggs and Morehouse were good friends, they may have schemed to defraud the insurance company and were now trying to get the money. He suspected that Briggs had killed his crew and stowed away on the De Gratia. Except Briggs actually owned a third of the stock shares in the Mary Celeste, so defrauding the insurance company didn't make a lot of sense. Plus, it didn't hold up in court that Briggs had somehow also murdered his wife and his child. Flood took an overly long time to determine that there wasn't any foul play, but in the end, he only awarded the crew of the De Gratia 1/6 of the $46,000 the Mary Celeste and her cargo had been insured for. So he couldn't prove it, but he still felt there was something fishy.
Right.
No pun intended. In subsequent months and years, other theories were thrown around. Some people suggested that the crew had gotten drunk. Remember, 9 of the 1,700 barrels of alcohol were empty, and then they probably mutinied. Except there were no signs of violence on the Mary Celeste at all. It was as if everyone was doing their jobs and then just vanished, with all of their belongings still neatly stowed away, and there was nothing out of place except for a few maps in the captain's quarters. Plus, the 9 empty barrels were made of red oak, which experts claim can cause alcohol to evaporate or leak. The other 1,691 barrels were made of white oak. The pirate theory was suggested that the Mary Celeste was attacked, but again, most of the alcohol was still there and nothing seemed overturned or out of place. One more plausible theory was that the heat of the Azores had caused the alcohol to evaporate very quickly and had blown the hatch cover off. People speculated that Briggs and his crew had abandoned ship because they were afraid the ship was going to catch on fire. However, the hatch was totally intact and still locked when Morehouse's first mate boarded the ship. Plus, none of Morehouse's crew detected any fumes. When these explanations didn't seem to explain how the Mary Celeste became a ghost ship, rumors flew that perhaps it was a sea monster that caused them to flee, or a waterspout. It wasn't until the late 20th century that alien abduction was passed around as a possible explanation. Several authors, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, his name comes up a lot.
It does.
In our show. It's not on purpose. He just seemed to have his hands in everything. He used the Mary Celeste as a basis for his books, and later movies were made out of them. In The Mystery of the Mary Celeste, a film starring Bela Lugosi in 1935, Lugosi plays a homicidal sailor aboard the ship. Some scholars believe that Lugosi's character was actually based on 2 brothers, Volkert and Boya Lorenzen. They were German crewmen aboard the Mary Celeste. The 2 brothers were considered suspicious because none of their belongings were found on the ship, but that too could be explained. They had both lost all of their personal belongings in a previous shipwreck. Documentary filmmaker Anne McGregor came up with another theory back in 2007. She and researchers were able to use Briggs' captain's log and the International Comprehensive Ocean Atmosphere Data Set, or ICOADS, which is a database that stores global marine information from 1784 to 2007. It's primarily used to study climate change, but it became an invaluable resource. She was able to show that the Mary Celeste could have drifted from 6 miles away from Santa Maria Island in the Azores to 400 miles away within the 10 days. She then wanted to know why Briggs would have abandoned his ship when he was initially just 6 miles away from land. They came to a startling conclusion. The chronometer on board the Mary Celeste was likely malfunctioning, and Briggs was actually 120 miles off course. Due to the storms and nasty wind, he was forced to change course several times, which just added to the issue. But that didn't seem like enough of a reason to abandon the ship, so McGregor dug even deeper. She was able to determine that on a previous voyage, the Mary Celeste had been carrying coal. And, if you remember, Briggs had also recently had the ship remodeled so his family would have their own cabin on board. McGregor wondered if coal dust and construction debris had inadvertently messed up the ship's pumps. As the water rose in the ship's hull, Briggs may have thought that they were in danger of sinking and had ordered that everyone abandon ship. I mean, that makes sense, but that still doesn't solve the whole mystery. Where did the 10 people from aboard the Mary Celeste go? Did they make it to Santa Maria Island and lived out the rest of their lives there? Did the weather turn on them again and the lifeboat sunk beneath the waves? This part of the story may never be answered. The tale of the Mary Celeste herself didn't end in 1872. Just 1 year later, she was back in service, despite being thoroughly labeled as cursed. In 1885, she was deliberately wrecked off the coast of Haiti. We know for sure that this time it was a case of insurance fraud. Hey, did you know? Salt was once a very expensive commodity. Only the wealthiest of the wealthy could afford it. So when you spilled the salt, it was deeply frowned upon as a major waste. And when you did, you were immediately supposed to throw a pinch of the wasted gold over your left shoulder. Why? Because the devil was believed to stand behind everyone's left shoulder when he paid a visit, and by throwing it at him, it would vanquish him, or any other evil entities lurking about, or it would at least slow them down. Who'da thunk it? So I have to say, I've been sick for about a week. I think it's allergies. So if my voice sounds scratchy and not its normal self, that's why. But I'm kind of happy to sit back now and listen to you tell your story. So what are you talking about tonight?
Well, let me just start off by saying this and see if you can guess. When it comes to UFOs, there is one entity that has become synonymous with little gray men. They are sometimes described as unnaturally pale. They have a propensity for dark colors, and they don't go anywhere without a fedora and the cliché dark shades.
It has to be the Men in Black.
Yes, it's the Men in Black. They've been tied to UFO stories since what feels like forever. But when we really think about it, and I assume most people think that the Men in Black started showing up right after Roswell, which was in 1947. They've reached a level of conspiracy and cliché all rolled into one. Are they government agents out to silence the witnesses? Or alien hybrids also out to silence the witnesses? Do they really even exist? So I thought we'd try and answer two questions. Just how long have the Men in Black been around, and who or what are they exactly? The answer to the first question might not be as cut and dry as you might think, because technically, the Men in Black have been showing up throughout history since pretty much the beginning of time, but they became a prominent figure, especially during the 1600s. To start at the beginning, demonic figures, including the devil himself, have been described as wearing black robes and the very earliest written accounts of people facing something evil. But when the witch trials of the 15 and 1600s began, it was almost universal that each accused person, bystander, or the accusers themselves described encounters with a male figure dressed all in black. For example, one woman who was accused of witchcraft, Agnes Sampson, was quoted as saying that the satanic figure she came into contact with was clad in an all-black gown with a black hat upon his head. You might argue that evil figures have always been dressed in black, so it's not really much of a connection to claim that the Men in Black existed as far back as the 1600s. Now, I did come across a really interesting article that discussed Arthur Jim Keefe's theory about accused witches. Stories often included strange marks on their bodies or on the bodies of those they cursed, and strangely enough, several of these early cases also included bright flashing blue lights that no one could explain.
So his theory is that the witch trials are connected to Men in Black?
Well, when you say it like that, it does sound kind of far-fetched. But when you combine a figure in black, strange marks on a human body, and bright flashes of unexplained light, there might be a connection, or there might not be. So I thought it was worth mentioning that there might be some similarities.
I'd never thought about it before, but that is a really interesting theory. Like, it's kind of out there. No offense to that guy that wrote about it, but how interesting.
It is interesting, and that's why I'm doing my story on it.
Well, duh, dear.
Now, from my research, it was June of 1947 when the modern Men in Black showed up. But despite what I initially thought, they didn't start with Roswell. They actually showed up a week or two earlier. On June 21st, 1947, a man named Harold Dahl and his son Charles were out in a boat on Puget Sound near Maury Island. Dahl was a conservationist, and he was gathering logs. He claimed he suddenly saw 6 donut-shaped objects hovering about half a mile over his head. One of the craft dropped 1,500 feet and rained down metallic debris. His son Charles was hit in the arm, and the family dog was so badly hit that it died.
Oh my gosh.
Luckily, despite what must have been terrifying chaos, Dahl was able to take some photographs of the aircraft, which he showed to his supervisor, Fred Chrisman. Although Chrisman was skeptical, he went out to the spot to look for evidence, and he too claimed to have seen something strange in the sky. Dahl then claimed that the following morning, a man came to see him dressed in a black suit. They went to a local diner for breakfast, where the man allegedly described to Dahl what Dahl had seen, as if the man in black had witnessed it too. Then he allegedly told Dahl, quote, "What I have said to you is proof that I know a great deal more about this experience of yours than you will want to believe." Then the man told Dahl that if Dahl told anyone else about what he had seen, quote, "bad things would happen." Now, all of this comes from a book titled They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, which was written by a man named Gray Barker, and it was published in 1956. Now, remember the name Gray Barker, because it matters later on in the story. 3 days after Dahl's encounter on June 24th, Kenneth Arnold had his own UFO sighting near Mount Rainier in Washington. Arnold was a pilot, and he was flying a DC-10 towards Yakima at about 9,500 feet when a bright flash caught him off guard. At first, he thought it must be another plane reflecting off his, but when he was able to spot the other aircraft, to his astonishment, there were 9 craft in sort of a chain formation, and even though he could see them very clearly from 20 to 25 miles away, he was positive that the aircraft didn't have any tails. At first, they flew in a formation similar to how geese fly, but then they began dipping and leaving formation in a way that caused multiple reflections to bounce off their hulls and blind him. He said that he felt as though they were purposely trying to blind him or disorient him. According to a 1949 government report on UFO sightings, Harold Dahl and Fred Crimson contacted a Chicago magazine trying to sell their story. Which is funny since the men in black who allegedly visited Dahl told him not to tell anyone else.
Of course, that's always the way. People are always told not to tell anybody, and then, of course, they do.
This magazine editor named Ray Palmer then contacted Kenneth Arnold and asked him to try and verify Dahl and Crimson's stories. According to this government report, Arnold got 2 A-2 Army intelligence officers to go investigate, but on the return flight, the B-25 aircraft that they were in caught fire and crashed, killing them both. The report then goes on to say that Dahl's UFO encounter and meeting with a man in black was a hoax that he and Crimson had admitted to. And yet, their story, whether it was true or not, Arnold's encounter and then the Roswell incident all happened within weeks of each other. But what about the men in black? It seems that they really didn't become part of the whole narrative until Barker's 1956 book. He based his retellings of Dahl's encounter mostly on the Chicago newspaper's editor notes, and he also used Albert K. Bender as a case study. Bender had been a huge UFO enthusiast for a long time. He founded the International Flying Saucer Bureau in 1952, which was the first civilian group of its kind. He published the group's research and findings in a journal called The Space Review, which was the first ufology publication ever. Shortly after creating the Bureau and his journal publication, Bender claimed he was visited by 3 men in black who came to his home in March of 1953. He claims they communicated with him telepathically and presented him with a metal disc, and they made him feel as if he was transported somewhere else, where they shared the origin of UFOs with him. When he found himself back in his home, the three men were gone. He said he couldn't eat for 3 days and had horrible headaches. But that was only their first visit. They came back, only this time they weren't as friendly. This time they appeared more as shadows, which hovered over the floor. They told him they took human bodies and used them to disguise themselves. Their human appearance was nothing more than an illusion, and that if he told anyone about their visit, no one would believe him. They knew that he had made important discoveries about aliens and UFOs and warned him to be very careful. Shortly after this visit, Bender dissolved the Bureau and stopped all publication of the Space Review. It was only October of 1953.
So he started the Bureau and publishing things in March of 1952, and by October of 53, Men in Black scared the heck out of him so badly that he just stopped everything.
That's exactly what happened.
Wow.
Gray Barker, the man I told you was important and to remember his name?
Yes.
Well, he was a member of Bender's International Flying Saucer Bureau, and he was the first one to publish anything about Bender's experiences with the Men in Black. Bender had nothing further to do with UFOs or aliens until he published his own book in 1962. In it, he described the Men in Black even further. He claimed, quote, "They floated about a foot off the floor. They looked like clergymen, but wore hats similar to Homburg style. The faces were not clearly discernible, for the hats partly hid and shaded them. The eyes of all three figures suddenly lit up like flashbulbs. They seemed to burn into my very soul as the pains above my eyes became almost unbearable." End quote. Just in case you were wondering, the Homburg is a felt hat with a center dent creased crown and a stiff brim with upturned edge. Dwight D. Eisenhower made it the hat of choice during his tenure as president, and Al Pacino also wore one in the Godfather movie.
Ah, see, I didn't know what a Homburg hat was, so thank you very much.
But back to my story. So, if it wasn't for these two books, would the Men in Black ever have been heard of? Even though they didn't figure into Kenneth Arnold's encounter or Roswell, as far as I know, they almost instantly became associated with UFOs. But why? Did that many people read those books? Or do they actually exist? Incidentally, Gray Barker also wrote an immensely popular book about the Mothman sightings of Point Pleasant, West Virginia.
Let me interrupt you for just a second. Didn't Dan Aykroyd claim to have some sort of MIB encounter?
Yes, I believe he did. It had something to do with him hosting or narrating a TV series about UFOs, and I believe he said he was being followed around by Men in Black suits. And then the network canceled it before it even aired without giving him any sort of explanation.
That's so... I want to say cool, but probably not if you're experiencing it. But that's cool.
So, in our modern culture, from the 1950s to today, what do the Men in Black look like? Well, I guess it depends on who they're visiting. Of course, they wear black suits and black hats, usually the fedora type. They also wear black sunglasses and they drive black cars. They come across as official, no nonsense, and vaguely to overtly threatening. But in some cases, they exhibit strange mannerisms as well, as if they don't exactly know how to move their bodies like a normal human. Or they use strange speech patterns. Now, what I find funny about the descriptions of the Men in Black brings me back to the Blues Brothers with Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi. Their attire looks a lot similar to the descriptions of the Men in Black. So now when I think about it, I was wondering, was that intentional or was it just a coincidence? Because Dan Aykroyd did say that he had an encounter with the Men in Black. So did Aykroyd base their costumes on this encounter with the men in black he had said to have? I don't know. I'd love to ask him sometime.
I've never actually watched any of the Blues Brothers stuff. I mean, I always knew who they were, but never actually watched any of it. But my impression of them was that they were government agents.
No, they weren't.
That's so interesting then.
Another example was described in The Casebook of the Men in Black. A family was visited by a man in black with uncommonly pale skin. He was also unusually tall and had large protruding eyes. He wore a fur hat, and when he spoke, his voice had a tinny quality to it. But then there's Dr. Herbert Hopkins' encounter with the Men in Black in 1976. His story, which comes from Nick Redfern's book, The True Stories of Real Men in Black, is really odd. So in case you've never heard of Nick Redfern before, he is one of the leaders in paranormal research. He's also an expert in cryptozoology as well as ufology. He's been on countless podcasts and on several TV programs. Apparently, Dr. Hopkins was at home in Old Orchard Beach, Maine, doing his own research on UFOs and alien abductions. One evening, he got a phone call from someone claiming to represent the New Jersey UFO Research Organization. He agreed to talk to this person, but as soon as he did, the person hung up. Then there was an immediate knock on his front door. When he opened the door, he was face to face with a very, very pale man dressed in black. The man's lips were unnaturally red, and he had no visible hair, none on his head, no eyelashes, no eyebrows. The strange visitor began to talk about the research Dr. Hopkins was doing. Then he told the doctor that he knew the doctor had 2 coins in his pocket. He told the doctor to take one out and hold it up. Dr. Hopkins did what he was told to do, and the coin disappeared right out of his hand. Then the strange man mentioned Barney Hill, a man who had his own UFO encounter in 1961 while he and his wife were out driving. Barney and Betty Hill's story might just be the most famous alien abduction case in U.S. history. Barney had recently died, and this odd man informed the doctor that Mr. Hill hadn't died from a heart attack, but because he knew too much. Then the man's speech seemed to slow down, and he claimed that he was running out of energy. He ended the conversation and disappeared into a bright light. Dr. Hopkins allegedly stopped doing his research after that. By the way, there was no New Jersey UFO Research Organization. So if the Men in Black do exist, who or what are they? There are a lot of people out there who would swear that the Men in Black are aliens in disguise, or some sort of alien-human hybrid. Then there's the other camp, people like Bender, who believed they were government agents.
Well, that's ironic, considering what he claimed they could do, like hover off the floor.
Well, maybe he thought they were capable of mind control and altering reality while still being human government agents.
That's a good point.
But how far down the rabbit hole do we really want to go?
All the way down, because that's what we do.
That is what we do. According to an incredibly fascinating article I came across in The Guardian, titled The Real Men in Black, Hollywood and the Great UFO Cover-Up, UFO sightings, Men in Black, all of it, has been fabricated by our government in order to discover just how deeply everyday people can observe them. Now, by them, I mean our government. So in other words, there are government agents whose job it is to deliberately encourage people who have claimed to encounter UFOs into sharing their information, even going as far as confiding in these people about what's really happening, in order to see how close these everyday people can get to the truth of what our government is up to, which isn't related to UFOs at all. These everyday people are tapping into top secret government projects, and rather than take the chance that these people will blow our cover or whatever aircraft or weapons we might have in development, They perpetuate the idea that it's aliens in order to make that person seem even wackier to their family, friends, and mainstream media. And while we're at it, let's get the mainstream media involved by releasing leaked videos and photographs that are actually our own technology, but let them scream UFO. So, are the real Men in Black just a bunch of liars? It's kind of an interesting idea, to say the least.
That is an interesting idea. Nefarious and underhanded, but interesting.
Author Benjamin Bradford brings up another good point in his 2012 Live Science article, Men in Black, the UFOs, Buff's Boogeyman. If the Men in Black were so menacing, so frightening, so threatening, then why do we even know that they exist? If they were doing their jobs, we shouldn't actually know about them at all. So who knows?
That's a great point. And I'd said it earlier, like these men come and threaten people, and people are like, oh, they threatened me not to talk about it, but I'm going to tell you about it.
Well, people always want to tell someone else about what happens to them.
Well, I know that's true.
Are the Men in Black really government agents warning UFO witnesses to keep quiet? Are they alien-human hybrids trying to keep a lid on things? Are they so ingrained in our pop culture that we feel they need to be included in UFO encounter stories, whether they really visited or not? Or are they part of an even bigger conspiracy, one in which our own government is messing with us so we don't blow the whistle on how advanced our own technology really is? Now, I have no clue. I kind of think we're all searching for the answers, but I find it kind of ridiculous that they would wear all black and drive black vehicles, which made them stick out like a sore thumb. Wouldn't you want to kind of be a bit more stealthy in your approach? I just don't get it.
I never thought about it that way.
Or is it to make people think that they're kind of cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs when they say they saw, these people all dressed in black and they pulled up in a black car and talked to them? That would make law enforcement and people kind of think, when you reported to them that you're a little bit off your rocker,
Right. And to go back to we're just hiding our own technology and playing it off as aliens to throw people off the truth. I'm wondering if groups that have investigated UFOs for the government, like, say, Project Blue Book, right, from the 50s, do the people that investigate them have such high-level clearance that they knew all the technology that our government had? And so then when they investigated and classified something as, quote, unknown, was it really unknown to them, or was it code for, we know what it is, but we can't say what it is?
Well, I think the people that were working for Project Blue Book would certainly know what our government had and possibly what other governments had also. But without a doubt in my mind, I believe that there is life out there, and I don't believe that the ones that have the technology to travel here mean us any harm, because they could have easily done it by now.
Right, and I think that too. If they were going to harm us, they wouldn't be waiting around to do it. They would have done it already.
More than likely. But I also believe that if we truly had this otherworldly technology from reverse engineering recovered alien technology, that we'd probably be using it against our enemies to play mind games with them. Kind of like, buzzing their warships that are out to sea, or playing cat and mouse with their military planes, or making appearances over their military installations, and quite possibly even blowing up some strategic, targets and blaming it on the alien aircraft. I mean, wouldn't it make sense to release the pics like the Tic Tac UFO and others that seem to just be toying with some of our most advanced military aircraft and be like, hey, we don't know what these are, but they aren't ours, and use that lie to engage in nefarious acts against other countries? I can see governments doing that, especially our government.
That is a deep, dark thought, my dear. You are so far down in the rabbit hole that you need a flashlight and a torch and a flare to find your way back up to the surface. Come into the light.
Well, when you think about it, I mean, really, wouldn't it Kind of makes sense.
That would be just, I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, it's just little things I think about. So I don't know if there's something to the Men in Black. I don't believe it's all make-believe, that's for sure. I think there are some little bits of truth in there. So I'd be interested to know what all you wanderers think. If you have a comment or an opinion, head on over to our Facebook page, because I think we'd both be curious to see what you all think.
We'd love to know what you think.
Well, with that said, I guess that about wraps it up for this episode, Beth.
Yeah, I guess so. And we will see all of you wanderers next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See y'all soon.
Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment. It really helps us move up the list so people can find us. See you next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.